Welcome to the HydroTech Helper web app tutorial. So this is what you see when you first go to the app. There's a series of main tabs that run across the top here. If you're accessing it on a phone, these might be condensed to a hamburger menu up at the top right. At first, you'll be in the Site Selection tab. You'll be prompted to select a state to begin. There's a drop-down menu that you can choose from, or you can just start typing in the name of the state and enter it that way. Once you select a state, you'll see another prompt asking you to select a site. There are three ways you can do this. The first is by typing in any part of the site's name and selecting it. You can also find a site using the site number by clicking here. And the third way to do it is by selecting Choose on Map. A map will show up with all the active sites in the state, and you can click on a site there. When you select a site, a series of tabs will show up underneath. The tabs that will appear depend on what data is available for that site. The Overview tab lists some general information about the site, such as location, site number, type, time zone, and the most recent measurement number and date. If you're getting ready to go out to a site, you can click this Copy Location to Clipboard button and then go over into Google Maps or whatever navigation app you use and paste it there. Underneath that information, you'll see a table of the most recent values for every parameter that's measured and published for the site. Below that, there's a map of the site. There are a few different base maps you can look at by checking or unchecking the boxes in the top right here. You can also measure distances using this tool here. The next tab is the Time Series tab. At the top, if gauge height is measured at the site, you'll see the 90-day gauge height maximum. Below that, you can select any available parameter for the site and select the date range you would like to see going back 90 days. Sections highlighted in red indicate a jump in the data, which is usually the result of mistransmissions that didn't get filled in. Underneath the time series, you can click on this checkbox here to see the individual values for the parameter and time period selected. If you're out at a site that you recently fixed and are waiting for new values to come in, you can hit this Refresh Time Series button to have the app fetch the newest values. The next tab is the Measurements tab. Here you will see all of the measurement data for the whole history of the site in descending order by measurement number. Clicking on this Generate Prediction button will activate a machine learning function that will make a prediction of where a measurement should take place based on the current gauge height and prioritizing more recent measurements. This can be very useful, especially if you're unfamiliar with the site and want to make a good measurement while avoiding any potentially dangerous situations. Below this is a time series with each point representing a measurement, and you can view discharge values or gauge height values. The red dashed line is the current value for that parameter. The Peaks tab accesses peak data for the site and reports the highest peak in the record, along with a graph of all the peaks with the highest peak highlighted in red. Down here we have the same data in tabular form. The Stats tab provides some interesting statistical data about the site. The first graph shows yearly mean discharges for all of the years the site has been active. The blue line is a trend line, and the red dashed line is the current instantaneous discharge value at the site, so you can see how it compares to those yearly averages. The second graph shows daily averages averaged over all the years of the site, along with a blue trend line and red dashed lines indicating the current value. Below this is daily averages for a specified water year. The next main tab up at the top is the Maintenance tab. The first sub-tab is labeled Fix It. Here we have a map showing sites which are missing recent values. The parameters taken into account for this map are gauge height and depth to water below land surface. These sliders here can be used to filter results. The first slider changes the lower threshold for how many hours since a value is reported. The second slider changes the upper threshold for how many days since the most recent value. There might be sites that have been recently discontinued or for some other reason do not need to be considered, which can eventually be filtered out when they reach that upper threshold. A table of the sites on the map, along with some information, is displayed under the map. Here you can see the station name, number, hours since the last value hit the internet, the time of that reading, the battery voltage if battery is set to be published for the site, and which parameter it's looking for. You can also download this table if you'd like to have something that you can print out. The next tab in the maintenance section is the battery tracker. This will show a map of all the sites for which battery voltage is set to published and accessible by the public, colored by that voltage value. You can click on any of these sites to see the exact battery voltage. The next sub-tab is the flatline tracker. Here you can select to see either sites that are currently flatlined or ones that have flatlined at any time within the last 2 days. What is considered flatlining can be selected by manipulating this slider here. It's initially set to 12 hours, meaning that all sites which have had a flatline of at least 12 hours will show up in this table. Clicking on a row in this table will bring up a 30-day time series with all the flatline periods highlighted in yellow. This gives you a sense of how normal or abnormal that flatline behavior might be at that site. You can also select a 2-day time series instead. The next main tab is the Values tab. The first sub-tab here is All Parameters. Here you can select any parameter that's measured somewhere in the state and see a map of those values. If you'd like to zoom into a specific site, you can start typing in the name of that site in the box here and select it, and then maybe compare values with nearby sites. By checking this box here, you can see sites that are missing recent values for that selected parameter. The next sub-tab is called Routine Prioritization. For this tutorial, we'll start by selecting Show Percentage here. This will bring up a map showing gauge height values as a percentage of the range of gauge height values that are associated with discharge measurements. To explain that further, I'll go down to the table below that lists all the discharge sites in tabular form and select a row. This will bring up that same time series we saw before, showing all the measurements in the site's history. By identifying the range of measured gauge height values for all measurements, we can assign a percentage value to each measurement and to the current gauge height. What we can also do is look at different ranges of percentages from the current gauge height and identify when the most recent measurement was made that falls into that range. We can visualize that on the map by selecting the Show Years selector. A slider will show up allowing you to set the range to 5, 10, or 15% from the current gauge height. The sites will then be colored by the amount of years since a measurement was made in that range, and the table below will be sorted accordingly. The next main tab is the High Water tab. We'll be going over to Colorado for this one, since they have more high water than Indiana does at the moment. The first sub-tab here is labeled Prioritization. This tab is very similar to the Routine Prioritization tab that we just looked at, except geared towards high water conditions. Sites will be filtered to a percentage range greater than a certain threshold that can be selected, thereby defining what high water is in this situation. You'll be able to view sites on the map colored either by the percentage or by years since the most recent measurement made where the gauge height was higher than the current gauge height value. Below the map, there will be a table showing the percentage, the number of measurements above the current gauge height, the year with the most recent of these measurements, the most recent measurement where the gauge height was within 10% of the current gauge height, the current gauge height, and whether the gauge height is falling, rising, or steady, and the hours since the last gauge height reading was reported by NWIS-Web. Clicking on one of these rows in the table will bring up that measurements time series. Below that will be a 24-hour time series showing the gauge height in relation to the gauge height values for those measurements above the current gauge height. Below that, there will be two peak comparison graphs comparing the current discharge and gauge height to the highest reported peaks at the site. The next sub-tab is the National Weather Service Forecast tab. This is very similar to the previous tab, except that it is accessing National Weather Service data and relating it to USGS site names and numbers. Instead of current gauge heights, it shows the highest forecasted gauge height for available sites over the amount of days selected here. The map will show the forecasted flood status of those sites. A similar prioritization table is generated below the map, instead this time showing the forecasted gauge height and the forecasted time the gauge height will be reached. Clicking a row in the table will bring up the measurements time series, but this time with an additional blue dashed line indicating the forecasted gauge height. The next sub-tab in this section is the National Weather Service Current Flooding tab. This map shows the current flood status of available sites. You can also click on any individual site to see the gauge height thresholds which determine that flood status. The Precip Totals tab takes precipitation data from all the sites in the state where precipitation data is available and totals those values over the past specified number of days. The QPF tab accesses the most recent 5-day quantitative precipitation forecast, which is the total amount of expected liquid precipitation as reported by NOAA. Clicking any spot on this map will retrieve a National Weather Service weather forecast for the coordinates of that point on the map, showing a probability of precipitation over the next 7 days. Now we'll go back to Indiana for the Planner tab. Say you're getting ready to go make some measurements and want some quick information about the sites before you leave. Here you can select those sites you're going to by typing in part of the name in the box and selecting them. Once you have a list of sites, you can hit the Generate Table button. A table will eventually show up, giving the site name, description, location, the gauge height. Then if it's a discharge site, it will also give you the predicted method of measurement, the last measurement number, and the last measurement date. There is also a map with the selected sites shown and labeled. You can download this table and map so that it can be printed out. The final tab is the Water Quality tab. Here we have a map of all the sites in the state that have water quality data for the selected water year. These sites can be filtered based on organization, characteristic, and project. So say you only want sites with pH values, you can filter to just those sites. If you only want data collected by USGS Indiana Water Science Center, then you can select that here and filter it. When you click on a site on the map, two tabs will show up beneath the map. One will have info about the site, and the other will have all the water quality data for that site. You can adjust the slider to get more data. And if you select a specific characteristic from the characteristic box, below the table you'll see a time series of that data colored by sample collection method. And that about wraps up the HydroTech Helper app in its current form. It's a work in progress, so some features may be added or changed in the future. I hope you enjoy the app, and thank you for taking the time to watch this video.